The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song at 2,300 hours, a sound Elena Martinez no longer heard. 16 years of night shifts meant the hum became part of the silence, the way breath becomes invisible after you stop thinking about breathing. Sacred Heart's ICU corridor stretched before her like a familiar battlefield, bed rails catching pale light, monitors casting their green glow against white walls, the smell of antiseptic layered over something underneath that never quite washed away. Mortality, maybe. The particular scent of bodies fighting to stay alive. She moved through the ward with precision, her left shoulder stiff when she reached for 4 bags on the top shelf. The shrapnel wound from Tikrit had healed 20 years ago, but her shoulder remembered what her mind had learned to forget, that metal moves faster than flesh, that the smallest pieces do the most damage. She favored her left side naturally now, a limp barely perceptible unless you knew what to look for. Elena had become expert at making herself small, readable only to those trained to see what wanted to stay hidden. The break room at 2330 was empty except for 3 nurses, Rodriguez, Kim, and Petty Officer Sarah Chen, who was studying for her RN boards while working nights. The conversation dropped the moment Elena set her coffee down. Not a dramatic silence. Not a pointed silence. Just the smooth, practiced withdrawal of 3 people who had learned that proximity to Elena Martinez meant social risk. Rodriguez glanced at her phone. Kim suddenly focused very hard on the vending machine. Chen gathered her books without making eye contact, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone leaving a room before it became awkward. Elena didn't watch them leave. She stirred her coffee, black, no sugar, the same way since the army, and fixed her gaze on the rain-streaked window. Outside, Portland's night pressed against the glass like something waiting. Dr. Ashford had cultivated this isolation with methodical precision, the way a surgeon cultivates a sterile field. 3 months of carefully placed comments. For write-ups for violations he'd bent policy to manufacture. A schedule that somehow always had her working solo. The night shift staff had learned the economics of disassociation, being seen with Elena meant becoming collateral. She understood the calculation. She didn't blame them. The coffee tasted the way it always did, efficient, necessary, empty of pleasure. Elena had trained herself not to want more than that from a break room coffee. Lower expectations meant fewer disappointments. She'd learned that lesson in Tikrit, in a field hospital under indirect fire where wanting clean water or uninterrupted sleep was a luxury that got people killed. Now she drank her coffee and watched the rain and thought about nothing at all. At 0145, she returned to the ICU for her second check of the night. Bed 6 had been empty all shift, waiting for something, though nobody said what. Elena passed Dr. Ashford at the nurse's station. He glanced up from his tablet with that particular expression, not quite contempt, but something adjacent. The expression of a man accustomed to his own importance noticing someone whose importance he'd successfully diminished. He looked back at his screen without greeting her. She was pulling the vitals on Mr. Chen, pneumonia patient, day 4, improving slowly, when the phone rang at 0200. Not the standard ward line. The emergency line. The sound had a different quality, a urgency baked into the ring itself. The charge nurse, Valerie, answered and her face did something that Elena recognized from experience. The tightening of someone receiving bad news. Critical incoming, Valerie said to no one and everyone. Multi-organ failure. ETA 8 minutes. They're requesting bed 6 specifically. ICU priority. They're sending it as a command. A command. Not a request. Commands meant military. Commands meant someone had authority that superseded hospital routine. Elena continued charting vitals on Mr. Chen, her hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who had performed these movements 10,000 times. Her heart rate didn't accelerate. Her breathing stayed steady. But something inside her, something beneath the trained calm, had gone very still. Valerie was already cleaning bed 6, stripping old linens and running an alcohol wipe over the rail. The other nurses materialized the way they did during critical incoming, efficient, focused, briefly unified by the single mission of preparation. Elena finished her charting and moved to the supply cabinet to pull the crash cart closer to the empty bed. Endotracheal tubes in ascending sizes, 7.5, 8.0, 8.5, organized in the neat rows that meant someone who'd organized them before had cared about what came next. She'd organized those rows 3 months ago, before the isolation had calcified into something permanent. The doors crashed open at 0203. 2 paramedics, their shoulders wet from rain, pushed a gurney that looked impossibly small beneath the collapse of medical urgency. 3-4 lines already running. A ventilator moving the patient's chest in mechanical rhythm. Monitors strapped to a torso that Elena couldn't yet see clearly because there were too many uniforms around the gurney, not hospital staff. Military. 2 men in navy working uniform blue, faces carved from something harder than regular features. They cleared the path with the absolute certainty of people accustomed to space opening up in front of them. Elena stepped back. Protocol demanded the physicians take lead position. She could see Dr. Ashford already moving toward bed 6, his tablet abandoned, his expression shifting into the clinical intensity he wore for critical patients. The paramedic called out vitals like a countdown, blood pressure 68/40 and dropping. Heart rate 142. Core temp 34.2. Multi-organ failure suspected secondary to septic shock. We had him seizing in the ambulance at 0156. We were able to stabilize with 3 rounds of epi and a wide-open fluid line. He's been unconscious for approximately 6 hours. Dr. Ashford began barking orders. I need 2 more large-bore 4s, push fluids wide open, get me a central line kit. Move him to bed 6. Somebody get a full workup, CBC, metabolic panel, lactate, blood cultures. We need a chest X-ray and a trauma sonogram stat. His voice had the quality of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly. Elena understood that tone. She'd heard it in the mirror for 7 years before she'd learned to make her voice smaller. That's when she saw the jacket. The patient's military jacket lay draped across the gurney rail, wet from rain, the fabric dark with moisture and something else, the particular dampness of emergency transport. The Navy SEAL insignia was visible even through the wet cloth, but it was the patch sewn into the jacket's lining that caught Elena's attention. Small, faded, the stitching coming loose at one corner, a unit patch from the 75th Ranger Regiment's attachment to Task Force 121, Tikrit Sector. The insignia Elena had sewn into her own locker door 20 years ago, the fabric worn thin from 20 years of hands touching it. She moved closer. Not close enough to obstruct the medical team, but close enough to see the patient's face as they transferred him from gurney to hospital bed with the kind of synchronized precision that came from training. Young face. Too young. But there was something in the bone structure, the set of the jaw beneath the sedation and shock. Elena felt something move in her chest that felt dangerously like recognition. She pushed it down. The patient was unconscious, still seizing slightly despite the sedation, his body racked with the involuntary muscle contractions that meant his nervous system was failing. His skin had the particular pallor of deep shock, not pale exactly, but drained of something essential, as if oxygen itself had abandoned him. A tactical watch was still strapped to his wrist, the face cracked, displaying 0214 in frozen numbers. Next to the watch, a mark. A scar. Thin, white, running the length of his inner forearm. The kind of scar that came from field medicine. From a tourniquet pulled tight enough to stop bleeding and stop life simultaneously. Elena's hands moved on their own, gathering supplies, running the crash cart closer, setting up the monitor leads with the kind of automatic precision that meant her training had become muscle memory. Her eyes found the patient's chart as Valerie scribbled information from the paramedic report, Naval Commander. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. No listed emergency contact. Medical file flagged as military priority encrypted. Commander. Navy SEAL. Tikrit unit patch. And in the moment before Dr. Ashford positioned himself directly between Elena and the bed, before the full weight of hospital protocol descended, before the 2 Navy officers stationed themselves at the door like sentries, Elena saw the patient's left hand. Palm up on the white sheet. And there, on the inner wrist above the scarred tourniquet line, was a tattoo, small, professional, the kind of mark that came from a forward operating base in 2004. A date. The 14th of July, 04, the day Elena pulled a 7-year-old boy from a collapsed building in the Jolan district, the day she'd applied direct pressure to a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, the day she'd stayed with that child for 6 hours until the medevac arrived. The day that boy had stopped crying and started praying in Arabic, and Elena had held his hand and somehow understood the prayers anyway. That 7-year-old boy had become a Navy SEAL commander. And he was dying in bed 6. Elena stepped back from the medical team, her face absolutely still, her breathing absolutely controlled. The room was moving around her with the organized chaos of critical incoming, orders being called, medications being drawn, the ventilator establishing its mechanical rhythm. Dr. Ashford was taking full control, and nobody was looking at her. Nobody was looking at the night shift nurse who suddenly had all the color drained from her face. She moved to the supply cabinet and pulled out a sterile drape set, her hand steady as surgical steel. The trembling wasn't fear. It was something she'd learned to recognize across 20 years of trauma medicine, the particular flavor of restraint that comes from having survived something worse. The rain hammered against the ICU windows like applause for something nobody else could see. Morning rounds hadn't started yet. Elena moved between beds with her medication card, checking vitals, adjusting drips, documenting the 1,000 small competencies that kept people alive while the physicians slept in their offices. The ICU at 0600 was her kingdom, fluorescent lights casting everything in the pale anonymity of night shift ending. She'd already worked 7 hours. 3 more until day staff arrived. She didn't count them anymore. Dr. Ashford entered through the double doors at 06 for 7 like a man carrying invisible authority, the kind that needed witnesses to feel real. His white coat was starched into angles. Medical students trailed behind him, 3 of them, all eager faces, all taking notes on tablets. The morning rounds would happen whether any of them had slept or not. Medicine didn't pause for exhaustion. Elena continued her documentation. Bed 2, vital stable, output appropriate, neurostatus unchanged. Bed 4, for running well, no infiltration, sedation holding. The observations kept coming from her hands while her mind filed them away in the precise architecture of trauma medicine, a structure built in places like Tikrit where you didn't have the luxury of forgetting details. Details saved lives. Details prevented catastrophes. Details were the difference between a patient who woke up and one who didn't. Rounds, Ashford announced, loud enough for the entire unit to hear. His voice had that particular resonance doctors cultivated, the kind that made nurses look up from their charts. Elena glanced toward the unit board where the charge nurse was reviewing assignments for the day's shift handoff. That's when she saw it. A printed sheet, laminated, posted on the bulletin board between the staff notices and the infection control reminder. Her name. Or rather, her initial and surname, Elena Martinez, performance violation. The typeface was large. Underlined. Dated yesterday. The charge nurse caught her eye, then looked away quickly, suddenly very interested in the staffing grid. Elena set down her pen. Took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came from deep muscle memory, from moments in field hospitals when everything was falling apart and breathing was the only anchor. She waited for the heat in her chest. The burn in her throat. The trembling that civilians experienced when publicly humiliated. It didn't come. Instead, she felt something familiar settle into her shoulders. The weight of witness. The knowledge that eyes were watching her reaction like it was part of their morning education. She turned from the bulletin board and looked directly at Ashford across the 30 feet of ICU space that separated them. She let one tear escape. Just one. It moved down her right cheek like a single drop of rain on glass. She watched it happen with the same detachment she watched O2 saturation numbers climb on a monitor. Data. Information. Meaningless without interpretation. She wiped it with steady fingers and met Ashford's gaze while doing it, her jaw set, her eyes clear. "I've been reprimanded for worse things by better men," she said. Not loud. Not accusatory. Just stated, like a fact on a chart. Like something someone had documented and filed away. The medical students exchanged glances. One of them, a young man with an expensive watch and the kind of posture that suggested his family had generational money, actually smiled. Ashford's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, a flicker like a predator recognizing that prey wasn't prey anymore. He turned to his students. Let's see the septic patient in exam room 4. Elena returned to her documentation. The tear had dried. Her hand was steady on the pen. She charted vitals and assessments with the same precision she'd used in Iraq, block letters, clear notation, every detail accounted for. The unit board had gone quiet. The nurses who'd been preparing for day shift rounds were suddenly very focused on their tasks. Exam room 4 held a 73-year-old man named Gerald Hutchins. He'd come in through the ER yesterday with abdominal pain that had cascaded into septic shock by midnight. His white count was 18,000. His lactate was 4.2. His kidney function was declining. Ashford had ordered cefazolin and gentamicin, the standard empiric coverage for community-acquired sepsis. It was appropriate protocol. It was also wrong for this patient. Elena knew it the way she knew how to read exit wounds. How to calculate remaining blood volume from vitals alone. How to recognize which patients were going to code in the next 4 hours and which ones would surprise you by walking out in 2 weeks. She knew it the way trauma surgeons knew it, not from textbooks, but from having seen patterns repeat themselves across hundreds of cases, each one slightly different, each one teaching something new about what humans could survive. Gerald had peritoneal signs. His CT scan showed free fluid in the pelvis. He'd spent 6 weeks in an assisted living facility before admission, and the facility's recent infection report mentioned resistant gram-negatives in their water system. Cefazolin wouldn't touch resistant organisms. Gentamicin was aminoglycoside monotherapy for something that would need broader coverage. The patient needed piperacillin-tazobactam, or at minimum, a fluoroquinolone with gram-negative penetration. Ashford moved into exam room 4 with his students flanking him like satellites. His presence had weight, the kind of weight that came from academic credentials and departmental politics and the simple fact that he'd never been told no by anyone with institutional authority. Elena followed with her medication cart, her latest assessments, the morning labs in her hands. "How's our friend doing?" Ashford asked Gerald, who was conscious and miserable, his daughter sitting in the corner chair looking terrified. 38.1 fever. Blood pressure's been holding on the saline, but he's complaining of increased abdominal pain, Elena reported. Clinical. Objective. Just data. I pulled the latest labs. His lactate climbed from 4.2 to 4.7 overnight. WBC is 19,200. Creatinine up to 2.1. Ashford nodded, reviewing the chart with the performative focus of someone doing medicine for witnesses. The sepsis protocol is working. We'll continue current antibiotic coverage. Push fluids. Monitor output. Elena didn't move. The medication cart sat between her and the door. The students were already writing in their tablets. Gerald's daughter was trying to interpret the significance of the numbers being discussed in front of her father like he wasn't present, like his fate was being decided by people who spoke in abbreviations and blood work. "Doctor," Elena said quietly, "I'd like to discuss the antibiotic selection." The room went still. Not the absence of sound, but something more deliberate, the kind of silence that happens when someone has broken protocol in a way everyone recognized immediately. Ashford turned slowly. His eyes had gone flat. His smile was the kind predators made before they moved. When he spoke, his voice was ice in a specific way that only authority could produce, soft and sharp at the same time. "Nurse Martinez, step into the hallway." She stepped into the hallway. He followed her out, and he didn't lower his voice. The medical students watched from exam room 4's doorway. They were getting education all right, just not the kind that appeared in textbooks. "You will not contradict my medical judgment in front of patients or their families." You will not second-guess my treatment plans. And you certainly will not do it in front of medical students who are here to learn appropriate hierarchy and protocol. Is that clear, or do I need to use smaller words? Elena's hands were steady at her sides. Her breathing was even. Everything about her body language suggested compliance, deference, the kind of posture that kept people safe in institutional hierarchies. Her voice came out soft, almost apologetic. The patient's presentation suggests resistant organisms. Cefazolin. I don't need a nursing lecture on microbiology, Ashford said, his voice still level but with edges now, edges like broken glass. Your job is to administer medications and monitor vitals. My job is to order them. When you understand the difference between our roles, let me know. He walked back into exam room 4. The students trailed behind him like remoras following a shark. The door closed softly. Elena stood in the hallway for approximately 7 seconds. Then she returned to her medication cart, finished her rounds, and documented every word of the interaction in the patient's chart, dated and timed. At 0800, when Ashford didn't return to check on Gerald's progress, she called the infectious disease consult anyway, phrasing it as a recommendation, not a physician order, keeping her role carefully within scope. The ID doc on call agreed with her assessment and called Ashford directly. By 0900, the antibiotics had been changed. Gerald Hutchins improved. But that wasn't what destroyed Dr. Ashford's week. By 1000 hours, another write-up appeared on the unit board, Elena Martinez, insubordination, professional boundary violation. This one was printed in a larger font. Ashford had called the hospital board. Not to discuss the antibiotic situation. To discuss concerning patterns of behavior, repeated questioning of physician authority, and his need for administrative support in maintaining proper hierarchical structure. The chief nursing officer called Elena into her office at 10:30. A written statement went into Elena's file. Ashford made 3 phone calls after that, not to the nursing director, but higher. To the hospital board members. To the physicians committee chair. To someone in administration who apparently owed him a favor. Each call, he mentioned the same phrase, significant liability exposure. Each call, he discussed a potential emergency case arriving at the hospital, the Navy SEAL with multi-organ failure, combat injuries, possible complications, legal ramifications. Each call, he explained why no physician should accept responsibility for the case without proper insurance review, proper board authorization, proper protection against lawsuits. By 1200 hours, the chief of medicine had sent an email to all attending physicians, do not accept case 2847A without direct board authorization. Liability concerns pending. By 1300 hours, every physician who might have taken the case had gotten the message. The case that hadn't even arrived yet. Elena didn't know that yet. She was sitting alone in the break room with her salad, eating methodically, her face revealing nothing to the 3 nurses who'd gathered their things and left when she sat down. She was thinking about Gerald Hutchins, about resistant organisms, about the fact that Ashford had been wrong and a patient had benefited from that wrongness being corrected. She was thinking about nothing at all, really. Just chewing. Just breathing. Just the particular flavor of restraint that comes from having survived things worse than hospital politics. Things like incoming mortars. Things like teaching a 7-year-old child how to stay alive in a combat zone. Things like watching the child you'd saved become a man and lose his health in ways you couldn't predict or prevent. The rain outside had finally stopped. The Portland morning had moved into afternoon. Elena's shift would end at 1500. 8 more hours to work. 8 more hours to wait for the emergency case that Ashford was already preparing to not have treated. She had no idea what was coming. But in her bones, in the place where trauma medicine lived alongside military training, she recognized the particular pressure of a trap being constructed. The emergency department doors hissed open at 0300 hours, and the commander arrived like a declassified secret nobody wanted to know. Tactical watch on one wrist. Combat boots laced tight. Blood pressure already falling. The paramedics delivered him to ICU bed 6 with a handoff that moved through the trauma bay like a funeral procession, efficient, quiet, final. Multi-organ failure. That was the diagnosis. That was also the death sentence everyone had already agreed to. Elena read the monitors before she read the chart. BP 82/50 and dropping. Oxygen saturation 89%. Heart rate climbing toward 130. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, each breath a negotiation with a body that was losing the argument. She moved to the bedside with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing what every second costs, and that was when her hand found the jacket draped across the chair beside the bed. The fabric was worn. Tactical. The kind of worn that comes from actual service, not from wearing a uniform to impress civilians at a bar. She lifted it without thinking, checking the pockets the way a field medic checks a casualty. And there, sewn into the lining just inside the collar, was the unit patch. Faded. Barely visible. But unmistakable. The same insignia she'd seen on the chest of a 7-year-old boy 20 years ago in Tikrit, the child she'd pulled from rubble when his neighborhood became a combat zone, the boy whose mother had held him in a hospital tent and whispered prayers Elena didn't understand. The boy had grown into a warrior. And now he was dying. Elena's hands moved to the 4 setup with practiced precision. Blood cultures. Lactate. CBC. CMP. The usual cascade of tests that would tell her what she already knew just by looking at him. His kidneys were shutting down, his liver was spilling toxins, his blood pressure was failing because his heart couldn't generate enough force to push against the infection that had invaded every system at once. She worked in silence, pulling the monitor strip to get a clearer picture of the rhythm. The ECG showed sinus tachycardia with early signs of strain. His troponin would be elevated. His creatinine climbing. The septic shock protocol should have started hours ago, but he hadn't arrived until tonight, and by then the only physicians available were the ones Dr. Ashford had already vaccinated against helping. At hour 2, the pattern became clear. Elena stood at the foot of the bed, staring at the vital sign trends on the monitor, and felt her military training recognize the cascade. She'd seen this in field hospitals. The sequence never changed. First, the blood pressure drops because the infection releases toxins that make blood vessels leak and dilate. Then the body tries to compensate by making the heart race faster, pump harder. Then the kidneys stop filtering because the blood pressure isn't high enough to perfuse them anymore. Then the liver starts to fail because it's not getting enough oxygen. Then the lungs start to fill because the heart can't pump the blood forward anymore, so it backs up into the pulmonary circulation. Then you have hours. Maybe less. The commander had maybe 2 hours before the failure became irreversible. Elena pressed the call button for physician consult at 0258 hours. She waited. Dr. Morrison was the hospitalist on call. He arrived 8 minutes later, glanced at the bedside monitors, read the vital signs on the chart, and said, "Not my patient. Surgical case." Then he left. Elena called again at 0310 hours. This time it was Dr. Chen, the infectious disease specialist. He looked at the culture results, which hadn't returned yet, and said, "No growth to guide therapy yet. Start empiric sepsis protocol and call back if something changes." But he didn't stay to assess. He didn't examine the patient. He didn't place his hand on the commander's abdomen to feel if there was an abscess, a pocket of infection that needed drainage. He just left, the same way people leave a movie they've already decided to hate. Elena called a third time at 0328 hours. "Every attending is committed," the operator said. Dr. Ashford's orders. She called at 0340 hours. "Every attending is committed." She didn't call again after that. She understood what was happening. She understood the architecture of the trap. Every physician at Sacred Heart had received the same message from Dr. Ashford, the one about liability exposure, about the risks of taking on a complex Navy SEAL case, about the hospital board's concerns. The message didn't need to be explicit. It never did. Just a phone call. Just a few words from someone with enough power to make a physician's career difficult if they didn't cooperate. Just enough pressure to ensure that when a dying commander arrived at Sacred Heart, every door in the hospital would be locked except one. Elena's door. The trap was designed to fail the patient or break the nurse. Either way, Dr. Ashford won. At hour 4, the commander's blood pressure bottomed out at 65/40, and the oxygen saturation alarm began its high-pitched wail, a sound like a bird with a broken wing, desperate and mechanical and never-ending. The monitor showed his SATS falling, 88, 85, 82. 82% meant his organs weren't getting enough oxygen. 82% meant every minute that passed was cellular death accumulating in the tissues that needed it most. Elena moved to the crash cart without hesitation, her movements the fluid precision of someone whose muscle memory had been forged in places where hesitation meant a patient died. She pulled a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the tray and reached for the sterile field prep. The left side of his chest. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Just like she'd done in the field hospitals outside Fallujah. Just like she'd done when the shrapnel in her shoulder was so fresh it still bled through the bandages. The scalpel felt familiar in her palm. She made the incision with the kind of confidence that came from knowing she was already committed, already past the point where hesitation mattered. The skin parted. The muscle beneath. The pleural space released its trapped air with a hiss like a breath that had been held too long, and the commander's oxygen saturation began to climb. 85. 88. 92. His blood pressure crept upward, 70/45, then 75/50, then 98/62. The cardiac monitor showed the strain lines beginning to flatten. His heart wasn't screaming anymore. He was going to live. But at the glass partition of the ICU, Dr. Ashford stood with his phone already recording, his face arranged in the expression of a man who had just acquired evidence of a crime. He didn't move toward the bed. He didn't offer assistance. He didn't do anything except stand there and document. Elena didn't look at him. She couldn't afford to look at him. She was too focused on securing the chest tube, on confirming the breath sounds had returned on the left side, on ensuring the 4 pumps were delivering the antibiotics fast enough to have any chance of overwhelming the infection before it destroyed what remained of the commander's organs. 20 minutes later, Dr. Ashford entered the ICU with a folder in his hand and 2 hospital administrators walking behind him like pallbearers. He didn't speak directly to Elena. He spoke to the room, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had already decided the narrative. That procedure was outside her scope of practice, he said, not looking at her. I have video documentation. I'm recommending immediate termination of employment and notification of the State Nursing Board. Elena didn't respond. She was checking the pressure readings, adjusting the ventilator settings, documenting the vital signs. The work didn't stop because the politics had arrived. The work never stopped. That was what Dr. Ashford didn't understand about people like her, people who'd held lives together under mortar fire didn't pause to argue about chain of command. The administrators looked uncomfortable. One of them said, "We should probably wait for legal review before." "I'm not recommending," Dr. Ashford said. "I'm requiring." She endangered the patient. She violated protocol. I have it on video. Elena finished documenting the commander's vitals. She checked the 4 lines one more time. She made sure everything was secure. Then, and only then, did she turn around. She made eye contact with Dr. Ashford for exactly 2 seconds, enough time for him to see that she wasn't afraid, wasn't angry, wasn't anything at all except what she was doing. Then she said, quietly, "He'll need cardiac monitoring through the night. Watch for arrhythmias when the endotoxin load decreases." She paused. "I'm going on break." And she walked past all 3 of them. Within 2 hours, the reassignments began. The ICU staff who usually worked alongside Elena were suddenly needed on other floors. Emergency transfers. Unexpected patient surges on the medical wards. The electronic scheduling system showed no nurse assigned to support bed 6 for the second half of the night shift. The pharmacy systems locked her out at 05 for 2 hours, administrative access restriction, new security protocol, no explanation. The lab requested all future orders go through the charge nurse instead. By the time dawn arrived, Elena was isolated at the bedside of a critically ill patient. No colleagues, no backup, no way to escalate if something went wrong. The trap had transformed. Now it wasn't about failing the patient. Now it was about breaking the nurse who'd refused to let him fail. That was when her phone rang. Hour 4. The commander's pressure bottomed out at 68/42, and the monitor shrieked its warning like something wounded. Elena didn't reach for the call button. She reached for the crash cart instead, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this before, not in Portland, not in a sterile ICU, but in a collapsed field hospital in Tikrit where the power had been cut by mortar fire and there was no attending physician, no backup, only her and the sound of artillery echoing off concrete walls 20 years ago. She opened the thoracotomy tray. Her fingers found the scalpel the way muscle memory finds its target, exact, inevitable, without hesitation. The blade went through the fourth intercostal space, and she felt the give of tissue like reading Braille in the dark. No time for sterile field. No time for the protocols that kept civilians alive. The commander was dying in front of her, and every second his heart wasn't pumping was oxygen debt accumulating in his brain like a countdown to irreversible damage. Blood. Copper and salt. The smell of it filled the space between them, and her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, someone who had held living hearts before, who knew the topology of the human chest the way a pilot knew the sky. She found the pericardium, pierced it with controlled pressure, felt the rush of fluid that meant tamponade, that meant his own pericardial sac had turned into a prison crushing the organ it was supposed to protect. 2 liters of blood drained into the basin. His pressure climbed. 74, 81. 88, the rhythm stabilized into something that resembled life instead of its ending. She held manual compression on the aorta, her left hand cradling a heart that didn't belong to her but somehow always had. This was the boy from Tikrit, 7 years old, pulled from rubble, given back to a life she'd never see unfold until this moment when it was nearly ending. Boots on tile. Ashford stood at the ICU glass, phone already in his hand. His face had the expression of a man watching his strategy collapse in real time. He saw her hand steady as surgical lasers. He saw the commander's vitals climbing. He saw everything he'd tried to orchestrate fail because he'd overlooked one critical variable, a nurse who'd been a surgeon before she became invisible in scrubs. The paperwork came before the sun rose. She found it in the mailbox at 05 for 2 hours, still dark outside, rain hammering Portland like applause for something she'd never wanted recognition for. Termination for cause. Practicing outside scope of practice. Performing unauthorized invasive procedures. Each phrase designed to strip away not just her job but her license, her credentials, everything that had kept her hidden for 2 decades. But the commander wasn't out of danger yet. Hour 6, his kidneys were failing, urine output dropping, creatinine climbing, the slow avalanche of multi-organ failure that took people down even after you pulled them back from the immediate edge. Pharmacy access had been mysteriously revoked from her credentials. She found out when she tried to pull vancomycin for a secondary infection blooming in his lungs and the system locked her out with a red banner, access denied. She took the elevator to the basement pharmacy. $217.43 on her personal Visa card because the hospital wouldn't process any medication order under her name. The pharmacist, an older man with kind eyes who didn't ask questions, gave her what she needed. Vancomycin powder. Albumin. And 4 bags of normal saline because the commander's kidneys weren't processing anything anymore and his fluid balance was teetering on the edge of pulmonary edema. Hour 7. She was alone in the ICU because Ashford had reassigned every other nurse to different units. The night shift charge nurse came by once, so Elena standing at the bedside with her sleeves rolled up and her hair falling out of its tie, and kept walking. Nobody wanted to be associated with a nurse about to be fired. Nobody wanted to catch what she had, which was the inability to walk away. She calculated the dialysate mix from memory. Sodium. Potassium. Calcium. Dextrose. The ratios came from a field hospital in Mosul in 2003 when they'd run out of proper dialysate and a medic named Rasinski had shown her how to improvise, how to keep someone's kidneys from shutting down when the military supply chain had broken under the weight of 14 simultaneous casualties and no medevac available until dawn. She mixed it in a clean container, ran it through the CRRT machine like she'd been trained to do by the army, not by Sacred Heart. His urine output increased. Yellow. Clear. The color of survival. Hour 8 arrived with 2 security guards and Dr. Ashford holding a folder like a weapon. He wore the expression of a man executing a long-planned revenge, a jaw tight, eyes bright, voice sharp as a scalpel. "You're dismissed effective immediately. Surrender your badge." Elena looked at the commander's monitor. BP 1050/68. Oxygen saturation 95%. Kidney function showing early improvement, the creatinine beginning its slow descent from the mountain it had climbed. She pulled the badge from around her neck and set it on the bedside table next to the unit patch from inside his jacket, that faded insignia from Tikrit, the one she'd been keeping like a prayer the entire shift. "He needs monitoring for 2 more hours to confirm stabilization," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. Her hands weren't shaking. The trembling was restraint, not fear, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Ashford's mouth tightened. "Security will escort you out now." She looked at the commander's face one final time. His eyes were still closed, still sedated, but something in his expression had changed. The tightness around his mouth was gone. The compression of a man in collapse had released. She'd held him together long enough for his body to remember how to do it on its own. Between the 2 guards, she walked out of the ICU. The fluorescent ceiling lights reflected off the polished floor like a path to somewhere she'd never intended to go. Her scrubs were stained. Her hands were stained. The kind of stains that washed out in cold water but never completely left your memory. She drove through Portland rain with both hands on the wheel because if she let go, she might not be able to put them back together. The termination letter sat on the passenger seat, the edges already curling from humidity. The investigative hold on her license was in an email on her phone. She'd read it 3 times, waiting for the words to mean something different. Willamette National Cemetery. The gates were open, always waiting for people who had nowhere else to go at 2,200 hours on a Tuesday. She parked in the gravel lot and walked in the dark, her feet knowing the way without her permission. Row 34. Section G. The marker was simple granite, the kind that didn't announce itself. Captain Marcus James Martinez. Beloved husband, fallen in service. Tikrit, Iraq, 2004. She knelt in the mud. The rain was cold and the grass was wet and her scrubs absorbed everything without complaint, the way she'd absorbed everything for 2 decades. She knelt there and the words came in whispers because they weren't meant for the living. "I saved him, Marcus. The boy from the rubble. He grew up and became a warrior like you. But I couldn't stay hidden. I couldn't let him die twice." The rain didn't answer. The cemetery didn't answer. Only the sound of her own breathing, ragged like a transmission breaking, like something that had held together for 20 years was finally admitting it couldn't anymore. "I couldn't save us. I couldn't save us and I couldn't save myself." She stayed until the rain became lighter, until the sky became less black and more dark gray, until the eastern edge of Portland showed a bruise of coming dawn. Then she drove home to an empty apartment where no medals hung on walls, where no uniform stayed in a closet, where a major in the United States Army became a woman who'd been fired by a hospital for doing exactly what she'd been trained to do. She sat on the edge of her bed and waited for nothing to arrive. But what came instead would change everything. The rain stopped at exactly 72 hours. Elena didn't know that yet. She was lying in her apartment above the Vietnamese restaurant on Southeast Morrison, listening to the fluorescent clock tick on her nightstand, watching the numbers change from 3:36 a.m. to 3:48 a.m., when Dr. Ashford was already 3 moves ahead of her in a game she didn't know they were still playing. Sacred Heart's morning shift started at 6 a.m. Elena wasn't there. She'd spent the past 3 days not sleeping, not eating, not speaking to anyone. The termination letter sat on her kitchen counter next to a bottle of pills Marcus had taken before the diagnosis one. She hadn't opened either. What she didn't know was that Dr. Ashford had spent those same 72 hours making phone calls. The first call came at 6:15 a.m. that Sunday morning, while Elena was still staring at her ceiling. Ashford sat in his office with the door locked, his fingers steady on his desk phone like a conductor orchestrating something intricate. He called the hospital's director of scheduling personally. His voice was calm, almost regretful. The ICU is experiencing significant liability exposure due to recent staffing complications, he said. I need the entire night shift rotation reassigned effective immediately. Move them to day floors, surgical floors preferred. Martinez's position will need coverage, but I want experienced staff only. The reassignments took 4 hours to process. By 10 a.m., Elena's colleagues, the 3 nurses who'd worked beside her at 2 a.m., who'd witnessed her perform bedside surgery without flinching, had been scattered across the hospital like seeds in wind. One went to orthopedics. One to pediatrics. One to the cardiac step-down unit. The isolation was surgical in its precision. The next call came at 11 a.m. Ashford contacted the pharmacy director personally. His tone was concerned, almost protective. I need to restrict access to controlled substances and lab requisition systems for one staff member, he said. Patient safety protocols. There's been some confusion about scope of practice. It's just a precautionary measure while we sort out some documentation. By 2 p.m., Elena's access cards had been reprogrammed. She could still walk into Sacred Heart. She could still clock in. But the locked cabinet that held the 4 medications was now inaccessible to her badge. The computer terminals that pulled lab results wouldn't recognize her credentials. The pharmacy would require a physician override for anything she needed. She was a nurse who couldn't access nursing supplies. She was a surgeon with no operating privileges. She was invisible, even when she was standing in the room. The third call was the one that changed everything, though Dr. Ashford didn't know it yet. At 3:44 p.m., Sunday afternoon, Ashford picked up his office phone again and dialed a number he'd kept in his personal Rolodex since 2009, a contact at the Oregon State Board of Nursing. His name was Dennis Harwick, a board investigator who'd helped Ashford bury a complaint from 2015 involving a patient who'd died from a medication error Ashford had claimed was a documentation problem. Dennis owed him. Dennis still owed him. Dennis, Ashford said warmly, I need to file a formal complaint and request a credential investigation. Staff member, Elena Martinez, RN. License number 347-861 NOR. Reason for investigation, scope of practice violations, patient endangerment concerns, and potential nursing malpractice. The words landed soft but heavy. Dennis asked no questions. He filed the complaint within the hour. Standard procedure would take 6 weeks. Routine background check. Review of credentials. Interview with the hospital. No rush. Just the machinery of bureaucracy turning. What Dennis didn't know, and what Ashford couldn't have predicted, was that Elena's credentials file had a federal flag buried 3 layers deep in the database, a security clearance designation from her Army service that had never been fully deactivated. Her medical discharge papers were stamped classified. Her overseas service records required DOD authorization to access. When the state board's routine background check hit that flag at hour 72, on Tuesday morning, 3:51 a.m., exactly 72 hours after the commander had arrived, the system didn't just trigger a review. It triggered an automatic federal hold that forced immediate unsealing of Elena's entire classified personnel file. The charge nurse who pulled Elena's record that morning, her name was Sarah Chen, and she'd never said a word against Elena, but she'd never said a word for her either, was holding a file that suddenly held different information. 30-year-old documents printed out fresh. At 5:23 a.m., when the commander's eyes opened for the first time in 72 hours, the first thing he saw was Elena standing at the foot of his bed, checking his line with hands that didn't shake. His eyes tracked her movement, the precision, the economy of motion, the way she didn't waste a single gesture. Major Martinez. His voice was still weak from the ventilator tube, but his eyes were clear. Certain. Elena didn't freeze. Didn't turn red. Didn't retreat. She just met his gaze and adjusted the monitor without breaking rhythm. That's when Sarah Chen walked into the room holding a freshly unsealed file with trembling hands. Not from fear. From the weight of what was printed on the pages she held. She read aloud quietly, as if the words themselves might shatter something. Army Major, Elena Catherine Martinez, Commission 1996, Discharge 2014, Combat Medical Badge, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Purple Heart. With each decoration, her voice got smaller because she was looking at a woman she'd written off as just a nurse. Just a nurse who'd been performing combat medicine in a Portland ICU while people treated her like she was insubordinate. The commander nodded once, as if confirming something he'd always known. By 2 p.m. that afternoon, the SEAL team leader walked through Sacred Heart's ICU corridors in dress uniform, the kind of uniform that made the floor go silent. His name was Commander Jack Reeves, and he'd served with Elena in Anbar Province 15 years after she'd saved him as a 7-year-old boy in Tikrit, after her medical discharge had pulled her out of the field. His voice carried through the hallway with the precision of a man used to giving orders that didn't require repetition. She held a field hospital for 16 hours under siege in Jolin district, he said to anyone who would listen, which was everyone. Doctors. Nurses. Administrators. The hospital's director of operations stood against the wall, listening. Single-handedly. No support. No backup. She trained half the combat medics who served in Anbar province. The techniques she developed in that field hospital are still in medical textbooks. By 4 p.m., the FBI liaison arrived, not with sirens, just a federal badge and quiet authority. The liaison met with hospital administration. Not to investigate Elena. To audit Dr. Ashford's cases. The ones Elena had questioned. The antibiotic protocol she'd challenged. The morning rounds where she'd said nothing, accepted his rebuke, but filed the consults anyway. The FBI found 6 patients whose charts had been altered. Ashford had changed medication timing stamps. He'd adjusted dosage records. He documented seeing lab results that showed his antibiotic choices were wrong, then prescribed those same antibiotics anyway. The pattern wasn't accidental. It was systematic. It was someone who'd been caught making mistakes and had chosen to rewrite the evidence instead of changing the protocols. Dr. Ashford stood in the ICU doorway that afternoon and watched Elena perform a routine lab draw on the commander, steady, efficient, her movements carrying the weight of 2 decades of field medicine. She didn't glance at him. Didn't acknowledge that she knew about the investigation that was already dismantling his career. He went very still, the way a predator goes still when it realizes it's become the prey. By Wednesday morning, Sacred Heart's board of directors had convened an emergency session. By Thursday, the state medical board had filed formal charges, falsifying medical records, patient endangerment, abuse of authority. By Friday, the chief of staff and the board member who played golf with Ashford had gone silent. Not defending him. Not even answering his calls. His malpractice insurance carrier dropped him that weekend. His medical license entered immediate review pending investigation. The local news ran the headline, "Decorated physician fired after combat surgeon's investigation reveals malpractice pattern." His attorney released a statement about administrative confusion. No hospital in a 3-state radius would interview him. Within 6 weeks, his retirement account would drain into legal fees. His wife would file for separation, citing irreconcilable differences and professional disgrace. Within 4 months, he'd be selling supplemental insurance from a folding table outside a strip mall on Morrison Street, smiling at retirees while his medical degree hung framed behind him like a memorial to someone dead. But that was the future. In the present moment, Dr. Ashford was still trying to figure out how a nurse he'd been methodically destroying had become a legend standing in his hospital. Elena's investigative hold was terminated by noon Friday. Her termination was reversed. Sacred Heart offered her full reinstatement, back pay, a promotion, and a formal apology that was read into the public record in front of every attending physician and administrator. The hospital board asked if she would serve as trauma department director. She said yes before they'd finished the sentence. By Monday morning, Elena walked through Sacred Heart's main entrance wearing a new badge. The one that said Major Elena Martinez, Trauma Department Director. The one that carried authority she'd always possessed but had never needed to speak aloud until now. She kept the commander's faded unit patch, the one she'd found sewn inside his jacket lining, identical to the one she'd lost in Tikrit 20 years ago, in a small frame on her office desk, the frayed fabric visible from the doorway. A reminder of the 7-year-old boy she'd pulled from rubble. The warrior she'd saved at hour 4. The life that had finally come home. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors among us. The ones who carry strength you'll never see until they're the only thing standing between you and the dark.